When you visit dozens of different countries every single year, it quickly becomes clear that your money goes much further in some places than it does in others. I mean, spending just one night in Hawaii would likely cost you more than a week in many budget travel destinations. So with that in mind, we'll be going over 10 of the cheapest places around the world to visit right now. In fact, these destinations are so cheap that all of them can cost you less than $50 a day. As I constantly travel around the world, I've experienced how cheap these places can be firsthand. But I've also experienced how some places that may seem cheap at first do have hidden fees. Stuff like expensive and complicated visas, mandatory tours, or other fees that can add thousands to your travel costs. So rest assured that in this video we'll be covering all of the costs of visiting these 10 places. And I'm pretty sure by the end of this video you will know where your next trip is to. Shoot, you might even be able to plan 2 or 3 trips with the amount of money you'll save. So let's get started with a country that's often overlooked but surprised even me with just how cheap it could be: Indonesia. This is the world's 4th largest country just after the US. Indonesia is an incredibly diverse place, but you've probably heard of Bali because it is the most visited part of the country. There's definitely a lot more to Indonesia than just Bali, and that's not to mention that Bali is the most expensive part of the country to visit. But even so, Bali is easy to visit for under $50 a day. For couples and groups, it's pretty easy to find a hotel room or B&B for between $20 and $50 a night. During my recent trip to Bali, I spent around 2 weeks there, and I mixed it up by staying at some local establishments and some chain hotels. And not even considering the rest of Indonesia, just the island of Bali is very diverse on its own. But pretty much anywhere you go on the island, you will be able to find affordable places to stay. And even the most popular tourist parts of the island, like Kuta Beach, still have plenty of good deals to be had. And when it comes to other costs like food or activities, everything is pretty manageable. Really, the only 2 things in Bali that could run your bill up a little bit more than you want, so over $50, would be spending a lot of time in and around luxury hotels and potentially transportation. Getting to many of the lesser visited parts of the island might either be time consuming or very expensive if you have to take a private transfer or taxi. And right after my visit to Indonesia, I did head over to Singapore, and let me tell you, even the best of best deals on food or hotels in Singapore would be at least 4 times more than what you'd have to pay for the same thing in Indonesia. So you're probably already sold on Indonesia. I mean, who wouldn't be? But the next 9 countries we'll look at all give Indonesia some pretty intense competition when it comes to being the perfect budget travel destination right now. Mexico might just be the most obvious country to include in this video. For travelers from all over the world, Mexico has long been a wallet-friendly and culturally interesting place to visit. You've got everything from massive all-inclusive beach resorts to rural experiences that give you the chance to really get to know the rich Mexican culture. Mexican food is just amazing, and every city and town in the country has some budget dining options. Plus, there's just so much iconic nature all throughout the country. You could definitely spend tons of money in over-touristed hotspots like Tulum. But even there, you will find plenty of budget options for everything from a place to stay to dining and activities. But having spent time myself in a few less visited parts of the country, I would definitely consider exploring beyond your typical Cancun, Mexico City, and Cabo. And let's not beat around the bush. A lot of people hear Mexico and immediately start to associate it with danger. I could point out statistics showing you that some parts of Mexico are actually less dangerous than certain parts of the US or other countries around the world. But the fact of the matter is that everywhere in the entire world has some risk, including wherever you happen to be right now. And as for Mexico, I visited Oaxaca, Puerto Vallarta, Mexico City, and the Yucatan Peninsula, so the area around where Cancun is. And all I personally encountered were interesting people, beautiful nature, and insanely good food. So sure, some less touristed parts of Mexico definitely have ongoing issues. But I highly recommend doing your own research using official sources before visiting anywhere. I'll personally be heading back to enjoy Mexico whenever the opportunity arises. But let's move on to another part of the world. Recently, Europe has become very expensive to visit. At least the most visited parts of Europe have. But just a few months ago, I took a trip to the Balkan country of Bosnia and Herzegovina and discovered that you can still travel in Europe on a budget of well under $50 a day. That's not to mention that I got the chance to get to know a beautiful place with beautiful people that could only really be described as underrated. Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And when talking about Sarajevo, we simply cannot avoid the fact that less than 30 years ago, this city spent almost 4 years under siege. This was an incredibly dark and challenging time for locals to live in. But as I quickly learned, the people of Sarajevo are resilient and very welcoming. But okay, don't mistake a trip to Bosnia and Herzegovina for a relaxing beach vacation or anything like that. There actually are beaches in the country and plenty of beautiful nature. But it's really the people that will inspire you and make you feel at home immediately. And of course, your experience can be very affordable. Places to stay in Sarajevo can vary quite a bit in price, but I was able to find a nice room at a locally run establishment for about $38 a night. Plus, costs like dining and transportation are significantly less than what you'll find in Western Europe. I don't usually take guided tours while traveling. Generally, I do find that DIY is the best way to save money while getting a better feel for the local culture. But in Sarajevo, I decided to take 2 different tours with a company called Meet Bosnia. They do free walking tours of the city as well as half-day and full-day tours to the surrounding areas. And while it's great to visit on your own and get to know locals on your own in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Meet Bosnia's tour guides really gave me a deeper and more hands-on understanding of what the country is like today and its recent tragic history. The next cheap country here is another one that I visited recently. At one point, this country was even considered the cheapest in the entire world. That's not quite true anymore, but we will get to the cheapest country in this video later on. I'm talking about Uzbekistan here, and it definitely still is one of the cheapest. I mean, at one time in Uzbekistan, you could buy a meal for less than $1. That's not quite the situation anymore. A nice meal in Uzbekistan costs a couple of dollars now. And speaking of food, it's not so often that an ex-Soviet country is a foodie destination in itself. Uzbekistan is though. Seriously, if food on a budget is important to you, it's hard to beat this Central Asian country. But the thing about Uzbekistan is that it was quite closed off to most of the world until recently. So now the country has been rapidly adapting its tourism industry. Things are still incredibly affordable compared to any Western country. And one thing I really love about Uzbekistan is it's exactly the kind of place where you can easily immerse yourself in the local culture. When I visited Uzbekistan this year, I found people to be incredibly friendly and nearly always pleased to meet visitors from anywhere. Plus, paid activities such as tours can often make up a significant amount of your expenses on any trip. In Uzbekistan, you can do a whole lot without any expensive paid activities. I mean, just taking a ride on one of the cheapest yet most beautiful metro systems in the world in Tashkent is a good start. Now, if you're looking for luxury on a budget, then Uzbekistan might not really be the place for you. But I stayed at a big range of hotels around the country. I mean, I spent everything from $20 a night to around $100 a night, and the standards are always acceptable, if not quite good. And another country where your money just goes really far right now is South Africa. Back a few years ago, I escaped the Northern Hemisphere's cold winter and went on a long road trip across the entire country. And based on my experience, taking a road trip around South Africa probably is the best way to experience the country. I mean, if you don't drive, there are options like organized tours or just visiting 1 or 2 cities. But doing your own self-drive trip can really give you the chance to experience a ton of different things across South Africa. Car rentals can cost you as little as about $20 a day, and this often already includes any one-way fees. And I mean, prices can really vary drastically, but there are a ton of good deals on places to stay all throughout South Africa. You'll find plenty of local places all around the country charging under $50 a night. But there is one useful travel hack when it comes to finding a place to stay in South Africa. Protea is one of the Marriott Bonvoy brands, and they've got hotels all over South Africa. But the thing about Protea hotels is that you can often redeem as little as 5,000 points a night to stay at one. And on top of that, when redeeming Marriott points, you get the 5th night free. So basically for 20,000 Marriott points, you could spend 5 nights in a pretty solid Protea hotel. I mean, even if you've never used points or miles to book anything, you don't really understand how they work, you could just go on the Marriott website right now, and for about $187, you could buy 20,000 Marriott points. So basically you could get 5 nights at a decent hotel for $187 and some change. But regardless of where you stay in South Africa, there are a lot of good deals to be had. And the fact that many of the national parks will let you do a self-drive safari is a real big plus considering how expensive safaris can be in other African countries. Oh yeah, and I nearly forgot, South African food is really good and quite cheap. You can usually eat pretty much anywhere in the country for under $5 a meal. Now when it comes to budget travel, we cannot forget about South America. There are a lot of really interesting places to visit down there. But countries like Peru and even Argentina aren't really as cheap as they were a few years ago. Colombia, on the other hand, continues to offer some of the most affordable experiences in the Americas, and now's quite the ideal time to visit. This is really true from cities like Medellin or bustling Bogota to Caribbean beach towns like Cartagena. You can stay in decent accommodations for between $20 and $40 per night. Plus, a delicious meal usually only costs a few dollars, and it's pretty easy to explore the country's natural beauty without spending that much money. And that's not to mention all of the vibrant Colombian culture around the country. There are really plenty of opportunities to experience local culture without spending that much money. And for me, Colombia is one of those countries in South America that I haven't had the chance to visit yet. So as I was doing my own research and planning for the year ahead, I was kind of surprised at just how far your money can go in Colombia. But circling back to Asia, there is a country where your money can probably go further, perhaps further than any other country in the world. I first visited Vietnam back in 2018 and was utterly shocked by how cheap it was to visit. Now, just like everywhere else in the world, global inflation has had an impact on Vietnam. But unlike most of the rest of the world, prices on stuff like food, hotels, and activities aren't too much different than what they were 6 years ago. So really, no matter what part of Vietnam you visit, you will be able to eat something really delicious for well under $5. And when it comes to finding a place to stay in Vietnam, in bigger cities, there is always a really wide range of options. If your focus is on going as budget as possible without sacrificing all of your comfort, then you'll probably end up finding a place for around $25. You may find that in some of the tourist hotspots such as Ha Long Bay or Hoi An, prices will be a little bit higher unless you go a little bit outside of the tourist hotspot. But other than that, as a visitor to Vietnam, it's a very, very cheap place with pretty high standards. Neighboring countries like Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand are also great to combine with a trip to Vietnam. But overall, Vietnam just comes out a little bit on top with the way that it combines low prices with the infrastructure needed to welcome visitors comfortably. And by the way, there are some other cool ways to combine a trip with neighboring Asian countries that we'll go over later in this video, so make sure to keep watching to the end. Now, this is a really interesting one. When I took my own trip here, it surprised me how cheap this place could be. The English-speaking part of North America might just be one of the last places you'd consider for a budget trip these days. On average, the prices you have to pay for food, activities, and paying for a place to stay can come out to be some of the most expensive in the world. But travel does not have to be super expensive everywhere in this part of North America. In fact, I recently took a road trip across Canada to prove that it's not. And okay, if you're the outdoorsy type, a great way to save when visiting Canada is to go camping. But you really don't have to be a fan of camping to take an affordable trip to Canada. Now, before we get into it, do keep in mind that I am not talking about a luxury trip here. But as I tested out on the ground, you can take a road trip in Canada for less than $50 a day. My recent road trip was from Calgary to Vancouver, which is a pretty good route for seeing a lot on the way and having access to affordable places to stay en route. Motels and mid-tier hotels will often charge less than $100 per night, and prices get lower the further away you get from the peak summer and peak winter seasons. Traveling in a group is usually the most cost-effective way to take a road trip across Canada. Many hotels will let you get one room for 4 people, though I'm definitely not saying that's the most glamorous way to travel. But my recent trip was actually just me and my wife, and for the most part, we were able to stay well under budget. In essence, a budget trip to Canada will not mean eating out at a restaurant multiple times a day. And let's be honest, your money will not go quite as far as in the other countries that we've looked at in this video. But other stuff like affordable car rentals, relatively cheap fuel compared to much of the world, and reasonable options in grocery stores mean a road trip in Canada could be a solid budget option. This is especially true if you live in North America and don't want to travel that far or pay long-haul prices for airfare. And if you're interested to see in detail what a road trip across Canada looks like, including the costs, I made another video for you. But that said, Morocco is another awesome budget destination that should not be overlooked. It's been growing in popularity a lot for the past few years, and prices have gone up a little bit, but it remains very affordable. In my experience, a nice budget vacation to Morocco almost always would involve staying in riads. You could basically think of a riad as a Moroccan bed and breakfast. You can usually find prices for around $50 a night for a room. In some cities it might be a little bit cheaper than that. And very often riads are just run by like one family, so you're almost guaranteed to have a pretty immersive cultural experience by staying at one. And outside of where to stay, Morocco is just like an awesome place to be. In cities, you'll always find a Medina, which is basically like an old town, usually with a pretty large marketplace in it. And then the entire country has very interesting natural surroundings. So whether it's the Atlas Mountains that you're interested in going on hikes in, or some surfing on the coast, Morocco's got it. And one thing about Morocco that's often overlooked by visitors is the fact that there's a train system. Quite a long time ago, I guess it was like 12 years ago now or something, I took a little train trip around Morocco, and it's a really interesting way to see the country on a budget. And I almost forgot, Moroccan food is delicious. You've got stuff like tagine, couscous, and prices are really low. I mean, if you're going for like fine dining or something, you might end up spending $20 or so, but a normal meal is going to cost you less than $5 in Morocco. And one more big benefit to visiting Morocco these days is that you can easily combine a trip to Morocco with a trip to Europe, or if you're based in Europe, it's just really easy to get to. There's a ton of different airlines flying there, whether you want low cost or like Lufthansa or Swiss or something. And basically the pricing has become almost the same as you'll find on intra-European flights. And the last cheap travel destination to go over here brings us back to Asia. But although Southeast Asia does often get the most recognition for being affordable to visit, there is a country that's cheaper than it's normally been that is in Asia but not in Southeast Asia. And then besides that country, there is China. Now once in country, China can actually be quite cheap. But the thing about China is that the prices can vary vastly depending on where you are in the country. And on top of that, there are some annoying hoops to jump through to get a visa for many nationalities. There is a cool hack around that visa issue though, and I used it to visit both Beijing and Shanghai. If you travel from one country to another country via China, you can actually stop in China for up to 6 days. So I just see that as yet another reason to include more than one country in a trip. And the fact that you don't have to pay anything at all to transit through China for up to 6 days means that you avoid the huge visa fee. But as interesting a place to visit as China can be, there's a country right next door that is much easier to visit and is pretty cheap these days. If you watched my roundup of the cheapest countries to visit in the world last year, you might recall that the Japanese yen being very weak meant it was a cheaper place to visit. Basically, bringing dollars or euros to Japan meant you'd get around 20 or 30% more value for your money than you would have before. This is still the case, and the thing about Japan is that it might just be the country that's best set up in the entire world to visit on a budget. You can find affordable accommodations in capsule hotels, guest houses, or business hotels, all of which are widely available throughout the country. Japanese public transportation is some of the best in the world too, and it's quite cheap. Within the same city, one ride is usually just a few dollars. And moving between different parts of the country can be just as cheap. The only real exception here is that the high-speed Shinkansen trains can be a little bit expensive. There used to be a nice way to save on these by buying the Japan Rail Pass. But since Japan Railways increased the prices for the pass significantly, it's usually cheaper to take domestic flights or use local trains. Then when it comes to food in Japan, the options are vast. For optimal value, grocery stores and convenience stores have plenty of ready-made meals for under $5, and lower-end restaurants are mostly really good and not much more expensive. Now, you're probably not going to find yourself at a Michelin star izakaya eating fresh sushi when you're traveling to Japan on a budget. That's just reality. But if you're in Japan and you really want some sushi around 6 or 7 p.m. every evening, the grocery stores often knock down the prices. But the standards for food are so high in Japan that sushi from the grocery store might just be better than any sushi that you'll find anywhere outside of Japan. And there you have it, 10 of the cheapest travel destinations in the world right now. But as a bonus cheap travel option, it is really worth looking into traveling to 2 or even 3 of these countries in one trip. It's often overlooked how you can travel to more than one place for around the same price or even less than traveling to just one place. For example, if you want to visit Vietnam, but Japan and Indonesia interest you too, you could easily book a multi-city itinerary with flights from your home airport to Japan and back from Indonesia. I call this the 2-for-1 hack, though in this case it's really a 3-for-1 hack. Regardless, I've saved thousands of dollars booking flights this way. And if you want to learn how to make use of this flight hack too, then check out my other video that goes in depth on the topic. But as for this video, do keep in mind that this video was not an exhaustive list of all of the budget-friendly places that you can visit in the world right now. But they are definitely 10 of the cheapest options in the world. So I wish you all happy travels this year and let us know where you'll be headed in the comments. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and share it with other travelers that might find it useful too. But thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video.